Yeah, thank you, Bill. And actually, that's a good analogy, gospel, because I do feel like I'm sort of this apostle. I used to wander around the country. Now I wander around the world, talking about sort of the power of doing this kind of journalism. I got started in it. I was probably close to 30 years ago in the U.S. back when I was a young reporter with the Miami Herald. You may know something about Miami, if you've seen on TV, Miami CSI or things like that. Whatever you think about it, it's all true. Miami is, the most bizarre place in the world. It's heaven for journalists because every strange thing in the world happens there. Corruption and shootouts in the street, and as I mentioned before, alligators eating poodles, and whatever. It's all happening in Miami. The Herald had a strong competitive newsroom, great writers, wonderful investigative reporters, and so on. And to be able to compete in a newsroom like that, you had to have an edge, and I sort of stumbled into my edge. Again, back when I was a substantially younger reporter in the early 1980s, about 1981, I was covering state government for the Herald up in the State Capitol Bureau in Tallahassee. And on the sort of on my own, just as a hobby, I bought a then brand new kind of computer, one of these personal computer things that had just started coming out. It was actually the one I bought was an Atari 800. I spent like $2,000 on it, real money back in the early 80s. And bought it basically to play with at home, to learn to write programs and play a few games on it and things like that. But I began to realize that I could actually use this gadget I was playing with at home, to help me do my job better. And that became an important edge in competing in a newsroom like the Herald. And sort of what I discovered is that I could use the computer in ways that would sort of let me do things that I was doing anyway, but would help me do them faster with more precision and so on. So for instance, I wound up learning to use spreadsheet programs to take state budget figures and analyze them, sort of calculate percentage changes and things like that. I wound up writing a program in BASIC, the computer language, to analyze roll call votes. When the legislature votes on something, the sort of typical thing we would do is say, the conservatives voted this way, the liberals voted that way. But that's not always the secret behind patterns in legislative voting. Sometimes it's the leadership versus the rank and file, or North Florida versus South Florida, or other kinds of things like that. And so this little program I wrote, I could put in a roll call vote, and it would spit out all these different patterns, and I could then pick out, again, on deadline, oh, this is interesting, this is different than you would have thought, and write my story. And my story became better because of the help of the computer. So, so over time, I began to discover more and more things that I could help me, again, do my job as a journalist. I'll be the first to add, I'm not trained as a computer scientist in any way. I never took any courses in this kind of thing. The only math I took in college was freshman calculus. I got the gentleman's C+. Never took any math or stats again, unfortunately, because I later discovered that having a better grounding in statistics would have been a big step forward. I spent basically the rest of my career teaching myself what I could have learned in a semester class in statistics in college. So let that be a lesson to all of us. So anyway, out to the apostle part of the thing. Over time, working at the Herald, I began to do more and more complicated kinds of data projects, moving from counting 120 legislative votes to counting thousands of crime incidents, or ultimately, probably my biggest story with the Miami Herald was when Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida in 1992. And we had, it was about 80,000 homes badly damaged. We had, and sort of as we were sort of recovering from this mess, and believe me, I was among those recovering. My own home was was among those destroyed down there. And as I stumbled out of the wreckage of my home, I was pissed because for years in living in South Florida, we had all been told that South Florida had the toughest building code in the nation because hurricanes kept coming through in Florida, though it had actually been about 20 years since we'd had a really good one like Hurricane Andrew turned out to be. So I had no idea why my home, which was like 5 miles away from the ocean, it wasn't like we were right on the water, should have been as badly damaged as that. Why was my roof off and all my windows blown out and so on, that far away? And why were 80,000 of my neighbors all in kind of the same condition? So the investigative team for the Herald, as the larger Herald was kind of writing about all the recovery that we were going through to try and get the city back up on its feet, several of us in the investigative team sat down and we said, can we figure out a way to answer the question, was this an act of God or was this our own stupidity? And more important, can we get beyond the finger pointing? Because what had immediately started happening after the storm is homeowners were all blaming the contractors who were building homes, saying, well, they must have built lousy homes. The contractors were all saying, gee, nobody could build homes to withstand these horrible winds and so on. So we wanted to know, is there a way we could actually tackle this question? Could we go beyond the finger pointing, go beyond the anecdote, somebody who had a bad situation and then somebody else who's sort of counter-arguing? Could we actually supply evidence on this argument? Could we look and come up with a reason why? And I realized, thanks to having done a variety of other increasingly, more sophisticated data stories, that we could tackle this. I could take the database that had been built by the government as they went around the damage area. They basically took a census of all the damaged homes, including the amount of damage and the location of it. So I could take that, and then I could take the property tax roll, which has information about every home in the area, and use software to bring those two things together to give me details about the homes that were damaged. And what I was looking for was what we call the smoking gun. Is there a pattern in this data that would let us answer that question? Is this God's fault or our fault? And I found the smoking gun. The smoking gun was the variable of the year that the house was built. And the variable, the smoking gun, was the newer the home, the more likely to be destroyed. So homes that were built back in the 60s and early 70s, back when actually hurricanes were coming through with pretty regularity, were built in a way to withstand that kind of thing. But then we went through a period where, there weren't any big storms coming through. A lot of people were moving to South Florida. They wanted nice homes. In fact, they wanted homes that looked like California homes, lots of glass and double wide front doors and that kind of thing. Turns out that's not a good idea in hurricane country, as we discovered. But also what was happening is because of the pressure to build homes, to keep them reasonably priced and so on, the building code was being weakened. The builders were seeking exemptions. Instead of putting plywood, 3/4 inch plywood on roofs, they got an exemption to put 1/2 inch plywood. Instead of having to hammer in nails every 6 inches to put the plywood on, they were allowed to use these pneumatic staplers, sometimes which actually miss the rafters when you're doing it, and so on. So a whole bunch of basically bad decisions. Nobody did this maliciously. We weren't uncovering crime. We were just uncovering stupidity. Led to what turned out to be, it was about an $8 billion disaster for South Florida. But the nice thing about being able to tackle this with computer is we were able to put evidence into our story. Instead of just having finger pointing going on, we could lay out, here is the pattern we found. We could then go to the building inspection records. So we took millions, literally millions of building inspection records that have been collected on computer over about a 10-year period. We took those, I ran them through the computer, and were able to find things like days in which a single building inspector, roofing inspector, was inspecting 60 roofs in a day. Now, the way a roof is supposed to be inspected is you get out of your truck, you carry the ladder over, you climb up on the roof, you look at the, make sure the nails are going in right, and so on. If you're doing 60 roofing inspections in a day, you're pretty much driving past at about 30 miles an hour and saying, looks like a roof, and checking it off. It's all you can do. They were under pressure to get their business done. we can pass those around too. So go ahead and get started on the sandwiches. Feel free. Don't mind me starving up here while you all eat. No, so anyway, so this was a powerful thing. I mean, I felt like I had like real power. I was uncovering a serious problem and helping my paper do a very important look at it. We also looked at the campaign contributions, which in the United States politicians have to file, where they are getting money from to run their campaigns. We analyzed that, tens of millions of dollars of contributions to the people who make the decisions about the building code. And not surprisingly, most of the influence is coming from builders and contractors and so on. So, all that came together into what I guess I would call a perfect storm of bad decisions. So, obviously, I by then was clearly a big fan of the power of computer-assisted reporting for big projects like that, and certainly in the U.S. and now actually growing around the world are any number of other news organizations that are starting to do really interesting big kinds of projects. It really sort of got started in the U.S., but I'm by no means so chauvinistic that I complain only the good stuff is being done there. It's actually really nice work being done in all kinds of different places now using these kinds of techniques, and I'll demonstrate some of the easy stuff here shortly. I'll mention a couple of other projects that really sort of caught the attention of investigative reporters around the country. Not only the Hurricane Andrew thing that I did, but a couple of years earlier in 1989, a young reporter named Bill Dedman, working for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It's a paper in Georgia in southeast United States. They were getting complaints from black residents of Atlanta who were saying, I've got a good job, I've got a good income, I went to a bank to borrow money to buy a home, and I got turned down. And so they would look into it, and the bank would always have a good reason why any particular person was being turned down. But what Bill Dedman's idea was to go around to the banks to collect there's basically a loan register that the Congress had required banks to start gathering. Anytime anybody walked into a bank and asked for papers to apply for a loan, the banks had to write down information about the person, their race, their gender, their income, the amount of loan they were requesting, and the location of the house that they wanted to buy.
So when they put race in there, was that because they suspected at the time this was already happening?
Right, they were hearing complaints like this, and so they told the banks, start gathering this stuff, and exactly right, it was a requirement coming from the government. But nobody had actually made any use of that, and that was the genius thing that Dedman did. He went around, gathered all these things, had them entered into the computer, and back then it was pretty much a matter of typing it all in. So thousands of these loan register documents, and he used that to find the pattern of loans in Atlanta. And among the things he found was it's basically a practice called redlining. It was as though the bankers had a map of Atlanta up there, and it was like they had drawn a red line around neighborhoods where they just weren't going to give loans. And of course, those neighborhoods were the black neighborhoods in Atlanta. And he was also able to go beyond just sort of showing these lone deserts out there to show things like a black resident had to have almost twice the income of a white resident to get the same size loan that the white resident was getting. So, again, if it was just a story about anecdotes of this, the banks would always have a good reason why any particular anecdote may not fit. But by looking at the total pattern, he put a wonderful spotlight on this practice to the point that it blew up. The banks finally said, okay, we got to stop doing that. And it turned out good for the banks because they actually wound up with more business. All of a sudden, a significant portion of the Atlanta population suddenly were customers again. So they got away from the old discrimination pattern and actually made business happen. So not now. I don't talk with my mouth full very well. So. Tempting though it is, but I'll wait. So anyway, again, this idea of database journalism is to use tools that help you find the patterns in the data. I talked earlier to students at Monash and pointed out that one of the things that we're doing when we do this kind of journalism is, again, we're sort of looking for the patterns, but in a way, in a different way, with a different mindset than, say, scientists do. Scientists love to create theories in which the data fits their theory. And they're always disturbed when they find outliers, when they find data points that don't fit their theory. Journalists, on the other hand, we love outliers. Outliers are where the stories often are. Those are the ones that aren't behaving like everybody else. And we can use this kind of software to find that kind of thing. The other thing we like are, instead of the middle, we're not so much interested in the average, we're always interested in the extremes. Who's best, who's worst, the biggest, the smallest, that kind of thing. So some of the tools I'll talk about here, demonstrate here shortly, let you do that kind of thing as well. I'll make one quick commercial here for public records laws. A great deal of the kind of stuff that I'm talking about requires access to good information, government information, that government is collecting madly. They have been doing it for years. Back when I started doing this stuff 30 years ago, I often had to create my own database because I would have to go to, like police stations and get paper records of things and then enter it in myself. Today, for 20 years or more, that's all been gone. Government uses computers as much or more than we do. Everything they do is entered into a computer. It's going into some kind of database or other. And what we want to do, we reporters want to do, is get those databases and find the patterns that are in there. And to me, it's just sort of this wonderful, because you're always finding these, these gold nuggets in the middle of, these big piles of data that government has gathered, that government generally hasn't analyzed themselves. In fact, they often get nervous when we do a public records request of their data because they realize they have no idea what we're going to find in there. So it's a wonderful feeling to know that you're kind of the first one. It's like, it's like opening King Tut's tomb and seeing the wonders that are in there and knowing nobody else has actually looked at it. So a huge part of doing good database journalism is being able to get your hands on data. So I don't need to tell you guys to make good use of the public records laws. I think the only thing I would say is don't think of public records just as pieces of paper. I know that's what most journalists think of it. You're asking for a particular report or a particular, letter that somebody has written, that evidence, that one piece of evidence that goes into a story. Start thinking also of public records requests as databases that are out there. And I'll show you what data looks like here in a second. So think about that kind of data. One place to find it actually is on government websites. Very often, you actually have a wonderful Bureau of Statistics gathers all kinds of information about life in Australia, not only demographic, but business and education. A whole variety of things are being gathered and are put up in pretty convenient forms on your Bureau of Statistics that you can pull down and do analysis with. But other kinds of websites as well have stuff. The ones that I find particularly rich are the ones that have what I guess I would call lookup pages on there. And the example I can think of would be, say, an education, Department of Education website where it might have a button that you can click and a thing will drop down with a list of the names of each of the schools in the state. And what people typically do is, go down the list, they find the school they're interested in, they click on it, and it will open up into a page that has information about that school. And that's great. That's a good thing for looking up a particular tree in the forest. But to do the data journalism stuff, we want to look at the entire forest. So what I always tell my students and the other reporters that I talk to is when you find one of those kinds of sites, say, great, go to the agency that has it, say, love your website, now can I have the database that is behind it? Because that whole lookup thing, there's a database sitting on a computer that they have access to that actually produces that web page that has the information about it. They can't even argue that it's not public record because they're already making it public. It's already on that website. So, go to them. I carry one of those thumb drives around, the little things that you can plug in with a USB port on it. Anytime I see something like that and I want the data, I whip out the thumb drive, say, hey, can I have that on this? If I get a report on paper where there's some kind of tables on it, say long list of names or incidents or something like that, I say, thanks, great piece of, great stack of paper. Can I get this same thing on this thumb drive? Because then I can take the thumb drive and pull it into Excel and do things with it. So I've sort of given you the very quick and dirty kind of reason to start thinking about this. As I say, it's being done in, for very big kinds of projects, whether it's, hurricane damage or, a recent one in the U.S. was USA Today newspaper they actually did a wonderful national project where they had gotten the list of the sites of lead smelters that had operated often decades earlier in the United States, long since out of business, closed down, factory's not even there anymore. But they got those sites because on those sites now, or right nearby, are often elementary schools, playgrounds, things like that. They sent reporters to all these places, got samples of the dirt there and found, toxic levels of lead still sitting there decades later. And so did this wonderful report, not only focusing on the problem, but also focusing on the failure of our Environmental Protection Agency to actually do something about it, because the EPA was certainly aware of this problem too. So, powerful story that could be done using this kind of thing. So, there are all kinds of stories that are big. There are all kinds of stories that are small. I'll just mention the one I'd mentioned in the class earlier. Again, there are lots of sort of daily things that can be done. Probably the best read computer-assisted story I ever did, wholly aside from all these, heavy thumb-sucking, investigative things, was when I got the database of dog licenses in Miami. 180,000 dog licenses that had the variables included, not only the name of the owner, but the name of the dog, the breed of the dog, age, a couple of things like that. And I used the computer to produce, the lists of the most popular breeds of dogs in Miami, the names that were most commonly used in each breed, hundreds of collies named Lassie and, hundreds of bulldogs named Winston and, that kind of thing. People are not very creative. I mentioned before, we found dozens of dogs that were named after the owner's name. It's like, come on, Steve, that kind of, it's just very silly. I couldn't understand that. Poodles and Dobermans were the two most popular breeds in Miami, which, clearly different parts of town were doing that. Lots of people were reading that particular story, which was, again, a computer-assisted, essentially feature story. One other feature story that I didn't do, but a friend of mine did, she took the list of all the personal ads that you've seen in the back of, alt weeklies and things like that. Men seeking women, women seeking men seeking men, all those kinds of things. Got all those characteristics, used the computer to analyze them, and basically, sort of produce the characteristics that each group is seeking from the other, and basically wound up proving that men are dogs. What can I say? But it was evidence. It wasn't just anecdote. So that was the beauty of it. So lots of fun things, I guess I'm saying, can be done with this as well. So let me turn to this. By the way, I'm talking on and on. Please, if you got a question or a comment or anything as I'm going on, just sing out. I'm not nearly so organized a speaker that this would bother me at all. So let's get this down here. And I'll open this up. Okay, this is the primary tool for at least getting a good running start into computer-assisted reporting. In fact, I can say that you could probably do 80% of what you ever would want to do in computer-assisted reporting can be done using Microsoft Excel. It is, it's basically rows and columns. The columns have letters, the rows have numbers, but it's actually an extremely big piece of paper. The latest version of Excel goes out now, and it's very difficult to see here, but XFFD is actually column something like 16,000 and something. So you could have that many variables. You'll hardly ever see a database with even a tenth as many variables as that, a few dozen at most. On the other hand, you may come across databases that can have lots of records, and Excel actually will go quite a way that way too. Goes over to just over 1 million rows of data can be held into Excel. So again, it's very difficult to come up with a a data set that you're likely to be working with in journalism that has any more records than that. If you do, on those occasions when you do need something for heavier lifting. And when I did the hospital thing that Bill mentioned, in that case, I did have to use a program that can handle actually 50 million records. You couldn't do that in Excel. So let's look at some data. I apologize first. This is all New South Wales stuff because I was preparing for something up at UTS. And normally I would have liked to have gotten your own, but at least with this you can see what a hellhole New South Wales is. So, okay, what I have here is some crime data. I think reasonably recent. It might be, I think it's 2011. Data that contains information about 50 of the different local government areas. The first column is the different sort of divisions in there. Everybody see? So you can see what we have here, and it contains the number of murders, assaults, and so on. You start moving across, more variables. So basically, there's a collection of about 6 or 7 different kinds of violent crime, and 6 or 7 different kinds of basically property crime or other nonviolent crime, basically. So these are the ones that have been reported to the police in that area, and I've got a column that also has the population of each of these things. So the things that the sort of journalistically useful things that you might do with something like this. I mean, this is the kind of thing you might go to the government and they would hand you a piece of paper that would have all this on there, and you'd look at it, and what you would realize is this is actually in the least interesting order possible. It's alphabetical order. This is only good for looking up a particular city. So if you wanted to go down and find, Wollongong, you'd scroll down until you hit Wollongong. But it tells you nothing that's sort of what I would call journalistically interesting. Things that we want to know about. The kind of stuff I look at this and I want to know about is, who's got the most, who's got the least, which areas have the highest crime, which areas have the lowest, and so on. And I always try and imagine myself, when I'm talking about this, that I'm a reporter on deadline. I'm trying to do some kind of story about crime. Maybe there's been a particularly horrific kind of crime of violence, and I want to put things in my story that will put it in context. Rather than just sort of this, isolated thing about a particular crime, I want to know, is this something new? Is there a pattern to this? So if I had this data already, I would look at it, and maybe the first thing I would want to do would be able to sort it. Because again, we're interested in who's the worst, who's the least. I'll start with murder because, of course, in the US we have an obsession with it. It's sort of a national activity. I pointed out in the other class that you Australians just aren't doing your part in murder. I looked at these numbers, and this is a weekend in Phoenix that we're talking about for the entire state. So anyway, but I look at this and I say, okay, I want to see where are the most of these. So I put my cursor in the column I'm interested in. I go up and find this button up at the top. You kind of see that, the little A to Z. Click next to it. I put it in descending order because up at the top I want the worst. I'm a journalist. And that fast I find, okay, Sydney had 6 murders. Inner Sydney had 6 murders, followed by Liverpool and so on. So again, in a second I've turned something that actually was in a not very interesting order that if I'd had on paper would have been, not that hard. I mean, there are only 50 cities or so in here, but I would have had to scroll down and find it. But imagine there were actually 500 cities, and it was everything in Australia or something else where it might have been 50,000. Obviously, I don't want to do that by hand, but I can do that very quickly. Again, in a second, click the button, and the order will change. I can do the same thing in, using one of the others, like domestic violence. So that fast we go through and change the orders. We can also see who is, least very easily. So Hunter's Hill, this is clearly not a friendly place for wife beaters, which is a good thing. Okay, that'd be the place to stay away from. So I look at that and I say, okay, this has been useful to me. Let's say what I want to do is focus on 222. Let me do this. Let's focus on which one of these? Inner Western Sydney. For some reason, maybe that's the place where my murder is. I want to look just at those particular cases out of these 50. For this, I can do something called filtering. So I go under Data, go down to Filter. When I click that, these little buttons appear across the top. And I can use that to do something as simple as this. Click on here, turn on off Select All, go down to, what did I say, Inner Western Sydney, I guess it was. Click on that. And that fast, it went through and pulled out just the Inner Western Sydney ones. So again, not so hard to do with just 50 of them, but if there were 5,000 of them, again, in that same instant, I would be able to pull up just what I'm looking for. You can do other kinds of sort of more complicated kinds of searching. Let's say I want to find out of all the, let's get all these back here. Hold on a minute. Oh, no, I'm in the wrong place there, pardon me. Okay, so we got everything back, all 51 of whatever ours are. Let's say I wanted to find every place that has actually the word Sydney in it. Okay, not just the Inner Sydney, but all those other ones. So I'm going to choose one that contains the word Sydney. And let's do this here. Hold on a minute. And it's gone through, and actually it's kind of hard to tell on here, but it's pulled up about half of them, about 26 of these. You can see over here in the Metro Sydney divisions, lower northern, upper, inner, outer, under, over, et cetera, et cetera. All those different kinds of Sydneys are there. You can also use that filtering to look for data ranges. You want to find, all the places with Sydney in them that have at least 100 or more crimes of violence or something like that. So again, very quickly you can go and find the things you're after. Let me show you a couple of other tricks here. Let's say I'm interested not just in particular types of crimes of violence, but of crimes of violence overall. So I'm going to insert a column. Call this violent crimes. Spell it right. Okay. Now I need a formula to add up everything from column E over to, I think it's L or M, something like that over there. So we will, in fact, let me see how far over I need to go. To column L. Okay. So I need equals. I'm going to use a function called sum, which adds stuff up. Everything from E2. You put in a colon, which means everything in between, to L2. Close the parentheses, add it up, and here in Hunters Hill we had a total of 55 violent crimes. Now, I only have to do this 51 more times, which obviously would be pretty tedious, but happily Excel is pretty smart. I can put my, and I'll give you the technical terms we use in computer-assisted reporting. You see the cursor there. This is what's known as the big fat white cross in computer-assisted reporting. But when you put the big fat white cross on this bottom right-hand corner, it becomes what? The little tiny black cross, right? Okay, yeah. See, now you're becoming computer-assisted reporters. Big fat white, little tiny black. Okay. You can do this. You hold down the mouse button and start dragging down, and it will copy. But even better, if you put it right there, and whoops, it's hard to do with this thing here, and double click, it copies it all the way down for you, at least until it hits a blank row. Okay? So now I've gone through and I've calculated all this. And notice what Excel has done. It has added up here, it's E2 to L2 for that one. But when I copied it to the next row, it changed the formula for me to E3 to L3, E4 to L4, and so on. So very quickly, it basically did a bunch of math that if I was trying to do on a pocket calculator, or my little pony or something like that calculator, it would have messed it up. So I now have the number of violent crimes in each of the places. But is this a fair way of comparing? Is Hunters Hill, in fact, a safer place than Blacktown? At least based on the number of them. What do I actually really need to do to be able to compare these places? What? Per capita or per something. Actually, per capita would be tough because you would wind up with 0.0004 crimes of violence per person in Sydney. Can anybody write a headline saying that? Of course not. So what we'll do is turn it into like per 10,000, which is the same, exactly right, same idea, crime rate. So I'm going to insert again a column. Let's go here, insert a column, call it violent crime rate. Okay, and I'm going to take the number of crimes, which is in this case E2, divide by the population, which is C2, and then multiply, this is where the high math part, doing all this kind of stuff together, by 10,000. Okay, I hit enter, and Hunters Hill has 40 crimes per 10,000 population, is basically the way to look at that. I put my little tiny black cross on the corner, double click, and I've calculated all those 51 different things. And happily for us journalists, they differ, they vary, the variables vary. That's a good thing, because now we can do this. Whoops, wait a minute, let's click in here and avoid doing, I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so we now, oh, come on, hold on a minute here. Okay, that's going in the wrong direction, and let's go in the correct direction. Okay, so what we have done now is we calculated a crime rate for all 51 cities. We look at it, and it varies. So we have places that have high crime rates, and at the other end, low crime rates. That's good. There's stories in that. You know, there's always stories when there are differences in things. Why should one area have, you know, for instance, I look at Campbelltown here with around 150,000 people, and way down at the other end, there is Hornsby, which has roughly the same population and only 44 crimes per 10,000. Huge difference in those two areas. Notice one thing that the data doesn't do. It does answer, you know, who and where and when and all those kinds of things. Data does not answer why. For that, you have to go back and do the kind of reporting you already know how to do, which is call up sources, ask questions, go to the cops, say, how come it's so different here as compared to there? Okay? So data journalism is not just hit a few buttons and stories magically appear. What data journalism does let you do is add depth to the stories that you still have to do the kind of reporting you already know. Now, let's do one little bit of social science with this. I look at the inner Sydney, you know, the actual Sydney, downtown Sydney area, and I see this huge violent crime rate. It's like more than twice the second one. Why would that be? Is Sydney such a hellhole that, you know, people are being mugged and murdered and so on in the streets at that kind of rate?
There's a lot more people that come from other areas to central Sydney.
Very good. You are already a data journalist and a precision journalist, which is basically applying social science stuff to journalism problems. Exactly right. Sydney is an area where it actually has a much larger population than the, 165,000. It's probably twice that much during the day. You know, all those people that come in to go to work, that are, you know, on the trains coming in, that are there at night, you know, all the big nightlife in Sydney and so on. I bet you have exactly the same pattern here in Melbourne. I saw the sort of sprawling suburbs that you have. All those people that are working in these buildings I can see out here are not counted in the population of this particular area, but are in the larger thing. Story I told this morning, I ran into this problem in Miami back in the day when Miami was, you know, the crime capital of the United States. And was about to write a story about the, you know, the huge crime rate in Miami. Called, you know, like the mayor's office to get their comment, and they said, oh, that's completely unfair. You know, Miami, we are a tourist destination. We always have lots more people here than are actually counted in the population. I said, you know, you're right. So I, you know, figured out things like the hotel occupancy rate standard through the year, and the number of people going through the airports, and the number of people going on cruise ships, and all this other kind of stuff about Miami. Figured out that there are about roughly 200,000 extra people in the city of Miami on any average day. So I added the 200,000 to the population, recalculated the crime rate, and we were still number one. But it was a little closer by then. So, but anyway, it does make a point that you have to be aware of. So, right here we've, in 10 minutes of playing with the spreadsheet, we've been doing journalism, which I think is a good thing. We can look and see, let's just calculate this. I'm going to do a quick property crime rate. Let's see if there's any differences here. So that's going to be equals the sum, sum of, what is it here? Here, here, across to here. Okay, I was using some shortcuts there as I was calculating this, but basically, I hope I wrote that right. Let's look at it. Yes, sum from column O2 to W2, that was the total. Oh, and what would then need to divide by the population, which is C2, and then multiply times 10,000. Okay, so the property crime rate there, and let's round this off. We don't need to the decimal points on that. We're going to do numbers, 0 decimal places, tell it okay. So 1,200 crimes per 10,000 population in Sydney. And once again, much higher there, but we also do see variation. We see places that are high, places that are low. We can sort in descending order. And we see, different patterns. Here, Newcastle is actually pretty high in property crime rate as compared to what their rate was in violent crime. Their violent crime rate was much lower. Apparently, people in Newcastle have more to steal and are too polite to go commit crime against each other or something like that. So anyway, again, there's no answer as to why those patterns are there, but the patterns are there to be explored by doing good journalism. One other thing to show you, there's a whole variety of different kinds of functions that Excel will do. And let me just, pop this up here. This brings up, they call it the formula builder function list, but there's well over 100 different functions. I will add that, I can touch type Excel. I use it daily. I have for years and years. I use maybe a third of all these functions. There are functions in here I haven't a clue what they do. They're used by engineers to design rockets and by hedge fund managers to figure out next year's profits and things like that. I don't know how to do any of that. My point of mentioning this is you don't have to know how to do everything with Excel to start doing interesting things. Just sorting alone, if you can get your data in there and sort it, it's like, aha, very suddenly you are able to do something that would be very difficult to do otherwise. So lots of functions there. The functions, I'll give you a quick overview at least of functions. Not only simple math functions like this divide and add and sum like that one. There's an average function, so you can just write a formula. It'll calculate the average of a column of numbers. There's a median function, which will calculate the median, which may be different than the average, the middle value as compared to the average value. There are a variety of date and time functions. You can calculate the number of days between two dates, for instance. More interestingly, sometimes you can calculate the time between two events. In the US, we've done public records requests for the emergency call logs, the 911 calls. When somebody calls in, says, my God, I need an ambulance, that call is logged, the time is logged. The time the ambulance is dispatched is logged. The time the ambulance gets there is logged. And reporters have done good stories by taking those logs, calculating the time, and then looking to see which parts of town are getting faster service than others. I'm sure you'll be shocked to discover that the rich areas of town seem to get faster service than the poor areas of town. But again, the pattern can be measured and turned into evidence by doing this kind of analysis. Okay, one other cool trick that Excel will do is called pivot tables. And what this lets you do is take a big pile of data that has categories in it and collapse it down by the categories. You know, as humans, we're not very good at, you know, anything more than about a dozen or 20 things, it just sort of turns into a pile. But what Excel will do for you is tell you how many there are of different kinds of things. So for instance, let's say my interest in this data would be to know the number of violent crimes occurring within each of these Metro Sydney divisions. So one way to do that, if I had to do it, would be to sort by this and then, you know, start looking through. Okay, there's 4,500 in Blacktown, but oops, here's Canterbury, Bankston. So I'd have to add these two together, these 1,700 and 1,200, add those. And then do it again for Central Coast and then for Central, you know. In other words, add up each of those pieces. That would take a while. And it would be, you know, if I was doing it on a calculator, all it takes is one keystroke and I've got an error in there. So I want to find a way to avoid that. Excel has a thing called pivot tables. If you go under data, go down to pivot table and hit this, you'll get something that looks like this. You know, there are different versions of Excel that have sort of different ways of doing it, but they all create sort of the same thing. And you say, okay, and all of a sudden your data seems to disappear. It's actually down here at the bottom. You see this little tab that brings it all back, but now I'm on a different sheet. And what I do when I'm building a pivot table is I imagine the piece of paper that would answer my question. So let's say my question is, how many violent crimes occurred within each of the Metro Sydney divisions? So I go over here to build my pivot table. I say, okay, I realize what I want is a column where each row is a Metro Sydney division, and next to it is a column of numbers, which is the number of crimes there. So I take Metro Sydney division, I put it down in row labels, and it goes through and immediately tells me all those. And then I take violent crimes, and I put it down here in values. And so that fast, it's gone through, sorted them all out, added up all those subtotals and put them there. And I can sort in descending order. And all of a sudden, I have my question answered in, what was that, 20 seconds or so. And that was dawdling around a little bit. Pivot tables are incredibly powerful. You can not only add up things like that, but you can do average. Let's see if I can successfully, you know, if I pick average instead of sum, tell it okay. Let's make it prettier. Number, one decimal place, 1,000 separator. Okay. So now it looks a little bit better. So that's the average number of violent crimes in each one of these places, a little bit different. I'm not sure that's actually a useful number, but you can see how quickly you can produce that. You can do maximums and minimums and so on. All that can be produced readily out of pivot tables. You can add other things into it. You can, let's see, we had property crime, oh, that's crime rate. Let's say for whatever reason we also wanted murders added into there. We could drop that there, and it builds that into the chart as well. So it's basically an interactive chart that will let you answer these kinds of questions that otherwise would be pretty tedious to try and do. Any questions about crime in Sydney, now that you know everything about it, perhaps more than people at the Sydney Herald do? Okay, whoops, wait a minute. Let me cancel this. I'm going to pop up one more spreadsheet. This is fire calls. I found this, I don't know, floating around on some site. It's actually 3 or 4 years, I think it's 2007 data. And it may have been prepared, as near as I can tell, it was prepared by the fire departments of New South Wales, because I think they were in some kind of budget fight. And they basically want to show how much stuff they're doing, what they're doing to protect the citizens of New South Wales. So it's a larger one. We have data for all 150 local government areas, 149 actually, because the first row is just our variables. So basically the number of each of these, we have the population, and then broken out by the types of types of calls that the fire department is getting. Actual fires and explosions, these other things. I'm particularly interested in these malicious false calls, you know, basically false alarms. And then different kinds of fires as well. Can anybody think of a journalistically interesting question that if you were a reporter in New South Wales, you might ask of this data?
Awesome.
Pardon?
Awesome.
Arson. Yeah, which of these are arson? Will this answer that question? And that's a good point you raised. Actually, this doesn't answer that question because there's no column that tells us the difference between, on fires and explosion, which ones are natural and which ones are arson. That's another good point about data. You know, sometimes the data can't answer your question, no matter how much you torture it. If the variable is not in there to do it, you can't. So that question actually can't be answered by this, and that's actually a skill that you need to have when you do this data journalism. You need to look at it and say what kinds of things can be asked and answered. Yes?
I think there are two at least to start with. The malicious false calls one.
Okay.
Which area has the most?
Right.
And also the non-fire rescues.
Right.
I think that's quite interesting compared to what the state agency says.
Okay, I agree. Let's focus on the malicious false calls right now. The way I would try and measure that is percentage of total incidents. Here we have total primary incidents, and I want to know what percentage of the times they get called out of the firehouse to go rush off to someplace actually turn out to be malicious false calls. Let's see if there is a difference there. So I'm going to insert it. Let's actually do it way over here.
Could you mind making it a bit bigger again?
Oh, sure, yeah, right, I went off to the wrongs. Is this better? Okay, good. So I'm going to write a formula. We're going to call this false alarm percentage. Okay, and I'm going to write a formula that will take the H2 and divide it by the total incidents that they have, K2. That produces a fraction, or a decimal here, and I'm going to turn that into a percent. And that's probably good enough like that. Okay, so in this particular city, Albury, whoops, sorry it's bouncing around so much, 4% of the times they get called out, 1 out of every 25 times is a false alarm. Now, again, if every city it's about 4%, it's the cost of doing business. But let's see if there's actually a difference. Little tiny black cross, double click, and ooh, looks like we have some different, ooh, got double figures something. Oh, journalism, you know, it's like I'm excited already. Okay, so now we sort, descending. We go up to the top, and look at this, Greater Hume. What's going on there? 1 out of every 9 calls is not only false alarm, it's a malicious one. Somebody out there is ringing the alarm bell way more than they should. Richmond Valley, 1 out of 10. I know nothing about any of these cities, where they are, or anything like that. Okay, but you know, there's a story sitting there in that difference. Let's see, other thing. You were looking at the what kind of non-fire rescues? Okay, I assume that's things. I don't know, cats up a tree. Okay, you know, people. In the U.S. we actually have something called the stupid motorist law, because in Arizona particularly, where they have washes and gullies, and every once in a while they get flash floods coming through. If there's rain up in the mountains, all of a sudden water will come through, and motorists are told, if you see water in a gully, don't try and drive through it because it may rise very quickly. And if you do and you get caught and you have to be rescued, you actually have to pay for the rescue, the stupid motorist law. So that's probably what these are. So let's look at, so it's E2. We want to know what percentage of, let's see, so rescue percent. So it's going to be E2 divided by, what did we say it was? K2, thank you. And E2. 4% there. Let's turn it into a percent. Whoops, let's do it this way. And, ooh, we got variation again. Okay, so, and we'll sort. Urala, that's all they do is rescue people. It's incredible. It's like twice as much as the next one. I mean, what's going on in Urala? I don't know, but boy, get a reporter out there fast. You know, I mean, you probably watch one of these happening, you know, just pick a random day, you know, it's got to be. Yeah, because they have a total of 176 incidents. That's 1 every 2 days. 3/4 of the, you know, if you're there for 4 days, you're guaranteed to be seeing one almost. So anyway, you know, again, this is lovely. The variable has varied. You found evidence for a story there. And there's sort of all kinds of possible things that you can do with that. we could, let's do one other thing. Well, let's try this here. The percentage, normally we think of firefighters as dealing with, buildings on fire. But I suspect that varies a lot too. So let's do building fire percent. Whoops. Okay, so equals the number of building fires divided by the total number of fires. And percent, vary this. And it varies too, good. So we have some lovely data here to look at. Bombala, whatever that is, more than half of the fires they deal with, in fact, are building fires. At the other extreme, let's look at that. Whatever these places are. My guess is these are places probably far out in the bush, places where the real problem there are big, what we call in the U.S. forest fires and so on. Pardon? Okay. So, I say I know nothing about any of these places, but the beauty of this is this at least varies. One other thing to look at when you look at something like this is you have to remember this is stuff being reported by a particular agency. Is it necessarily true? We'd like to think it is, but it isn't necessarily true. There have been wonderful stories done, I can think of a couple in the US, where actually there's one in Philadelphia where a reporter was taking data like this, crime data for Philadelphia, and sort of doing some sorts and comparing Philadelphia's crime rates with some other cities that are similar to Philadelphia, and noticed that the sexual crime rate in Philadelphia was astonishingly low. It was much lower than other cities, at a minuscule rate compared to other cities. Either Philadelphia residents are, disinclined to do rape and sexual assault, or something else was going on. It will not surprise you to know something else was going on. What was going on was the Philadelphia police were under all kinds of pressure to do something about crime, particularly sexual assault that had been a considerable problem. So their approach to dealing with that was to turn rapes into purse snatchings. So it's just basically downgrading crime. It was kind of the opposite of the hospital thing that I was doing, where the hospitals were upcoding. They were turning normal everyday conditions into life-threatening ones so they get paid more by the government. In this case, it was the other way around. The cops were just cooking the data to make it look better. And but the look at the pattern is what showed it's this anomaly, this outlier. Basically, Philadelphia didn't look like the others. And that it didn't say why. They had to go find out why, but then they did. Wound up a great series of stories. They put the database up of all the reported crimes and wound up with additional stories because people could go look up their own crime that they had reported, and many people were discovering, my God, here I was attacked or robbed, and it got turned into, nothing. And so they wound up with whole additional stories based on doing that. So. That's again a sort of real power of being able to do this kind of thing. The other good one of that kind of thing, a young intern at the Washington Post, a girl who's still in college, she was an intern, but she had been working with Excel when she was at the University of Missouri. Anyway, she went to the Post, got the FBI, our Federal Bureau of Investigation, produces a sort of annual uniform crime report and kind of additional data about crime in the United States. One of the statistics they gather is shootings. The number of people that are shot, and particularly officer-involved shootings. The number of times that police officers have had to shoot somebody. And she looked at the data and noticed that the city of Washington police force had a extraordinarily low rate of, seemingly low rate of officer-involved shootings compared to other cities. And she brought that to the attention of the investigative editor, Jeff Lean, who said, gee, that's interesting because I keep hearing about, shootings and so on. So they started looking into it. What they discovered is at least when the FBI gathers the information, they don't count ones in which the officer where the shooting is considered justified. In other words, he shot him, but, gee, it was in the middle of something like that, so it just isn't even counted. Well, of course, what was happening in Washington was almost every officer-involved shooting was considered justified. The higher management said, yep, sure, no problem. And actually, it turned out that Washington had a high rate of officer-involved shootings. They were shooting everybody in town. And they had horrible training for the officers on dealing with it, and this young intern is who helped uncover it, and the Post won a Pulitzer for that particular project. So great example of, again, finding a pattern or an anomalous pattern in the data, something that didn't look right, and that's kind of what you can do with this thing. Is there anything else? I mean, I know you guys actually have real jobs, and the sandwiches are gone and all that kind of stuff, so no point in hanging around here much longer. But is there anything else that you would like to ask or talk about?
Sort of a very basic question, but with the police data, how did you get that and how easy was it to get?
It wasn't hard. I mean, I was actually sitting in my daughter's apartment in Wollongong, actually, when I was throwing that part together, searching around for data that had something to do with New South Wales. I think I had done something like, here's actually a good trick with Google. You can search, not only using search terms like, crime and New South Wales, but you can also put in file type :XLS, which will not only find what you're looking for, but also find Excel spreadsheets. Now, whether that was an Excel spreadsheet or I may have come across, I mean, I'd have to look and find out what I found. But basically, there was a government website that had this data. It might have been on the Bureau of Statistics site. I'd have to go back and.
It was publicly available.
Oh, public available, right? Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, no, it was no FOI. It was on a website. I just downloaded. I did have to do a little massage to make it. There was some stuff to clean out. I think I went and got the population data from the Bureau of Statistics site and puts that in there so I could do that part of the demo. But yeah, I did no FOIs for any of this stuff.
That leads to a second question I've got is combining databases.
Okay.
Let's say with this Far East one, let's say you wanted to look at the correlations between CFA volunteers and
Right.
bushfires,
Sure.
for instance. Could you do that?
Absolutely. Right. There are additional tools for dealing with combining stuff. In this case, if you had two different databases that both had, let's say, the 150 local government areas in it, it's actually not hard to, you could sort both of those by local government area. As long as they all matched up, you could just cut and paste and put them right into the same spreadsheet. Sometimes you have more complicated things, and then you need another tool, a database program. And the example I often use is, imagine you have a database that has the list of all the people who are school bus drivers in your state, for instance. They have that special license and they're working for school departments, and they have in that database not only their name and all that, but has their driver's license number. And then you go get from the police the list of all people who've been convicted of drunk driving in the state that has their names and has their driver's license number. And you bring those two things together, and what do you get? Drunk school bus drivers, basically, right? Or at least people who probably shouldn't be school bus drivers. They have records of convictions. This story, sadly, is sort of done regularly in the U.S. and almost inevitably, reporters discover there are dozens of people who are, either working as school bus drivers or are teachers who've been convicted of crimes where they probably shouldn't be around children, those kinds of things. And of course, the school system's all, oh my God, how could we have known? Well, actually, if they'd basically done the same thing we did in an afternoon, they could have known. So, the tool to bring things together like that would be some kind of database program. A simple one is Microsoft Access, which if you have the Microsoft Office thing, like Word, I don't know what you guys write on. Do you write on Word here? Okay, some other thing. But if you have Microsoft Office, you'll have Excel. If you have Office for a PC, for the IBM side of the world, then it actually has Access in it. The Mac stuff doesn't, and I have no idea why, but there are other programs that will do that. Yeah?
Does any of this work with OpenOffice?
I'm sorry?
Does any of this work with OpenOffice?
The open source one? Sure, yeah.
Do exactly this?
I believe you can do all this stuff. I mean, I tend to use Excel because I've got it, and most people are using that, but I think there's some slight differences in syntax. Instead of using a colon in the sum thing, I think it uses a semicolon. You know, little differences like that, but the same concepts. It'll sort, it'll filter. I think it does the equivalent of pivot tables. I'll add there, you can also use like Google Docs. You know, in Google Docs documents, there's a spreadsheet version. In addition, with Google Docs, you can pull data like this. Let's say has well, this data actually would work well because it has the the names of these districts or the local government areas. You can pull that into Google Fusion tables and hit a couple of buttons, and a map will appear with dots all over it that are colored by let's say the number of fires or whatever. So you can almost instantly make a map showing you the pattern of whatever is going on. I tried to actually demonstrate that, but guaranteed that would blow up if I tried to actually do it. But I promise you it can be done doing that. Yeah. Oh yeah. Let me mention a couple of other sort of resource things. One, I would say, wholly aside from the Melbourne, Australian Advanced Journalism Center.
I don't know, I think that
Okay.
American stuff would be better.
Okay, well, I mean, there are places here that will do more, and I always like to throw out a good commercial for local. Join the press club too, by the way. Is that right? Okay. But consider having some of you guys ought to join IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors, IRE.org. I think for professionals, it's something, I don't know, $65 a year, something like that. It gives you access to all kinds of resources that are there. One of those things you access is it's called the National Institute of Computer Assisted Reporting, which sounds very grand, but it's basically the teaching arm of IRE, where we have taught literally thousands of reporters how to do exactly these kinds of things. And a lot of the material is online, so you can actually download tutorials, data sets that will help you walk through and sort of get comfortable with doing this. The other thing to mention is something that just came out. It's called the Data Journalism Handbook. Let me throw up the URL here for you. I think I have the name right, and I want to make sure you. Oh, let's see. Oh, I don't have online here, so I won't do that. Let's go down to here. Okay. I don't know why that's doing that up there. Oh, there we go. Okay. This thing. This just got created by, well, the idea came out of a conference that was going on in London back last fall. A group of reporters said, gee, what data journalism needs is some kind of handbook to give people an idea what's going on in it, what can be done. And sort of a call went out among the people that do this. A whole bunch of us, it turned out there were about 70 of us that wound up contributing to this thing. And in sort of just 6 months, this all got put together and was released last month at a big conference in Italy. The price is right, free. Can't beat that. Go to datajournalismhandbook.org, click on the free thing, and it's, I don't know, is it 100 pages, something like that, but sort of why doing it, a bit of how. It's not really a hands-on handbook of, doing all the detailed stuff, but it's more showing the possibilities, and there are all kinds of case studies in there. And again, it's absolutely not U.S.-centric. It is definitely international. A wide range of people from all around the world contributed to writing parts of this and supplying case studies and so on. So if you want to get a flavor of additional things that kind of can be done, I would say this is a great thing to do. Other questions? Yeah.
How hard is it to copy, sort of say, tables of data out of PDFs rather than Excel files? And also, do you know any reputable sites where some PDFs are really locked down a lot of the functionality?
Yeah.
You can actually
Crack them. Yeah.
sources?
Reputable. Yeah. We could do it, but it would be wrong. There are sites for doing that. Actually, there's I have to. Yeah, yeah, I'm not that fussy. There are some PDFs are a huge pain in the ass, frankly, because the government likes it because they sort of feel that they can, they're sort of giving you the way they want it to look. And of course, our problem is cracking it and getting the data into, say, something like Excel. Sometimes you can just do, like a Command A, select all, go over to Excel, paste, and voila, it'll all magically appear. Other times it'll be a huge mess when you do that. There are sites like PDF to XLS is one that purports to do it among the other. In fact, you can Google sort of PDF to Excel, and you will find a variety of sites, some of which actually will do a good job on those. I've gotten pretty good results by using Adobe Acrobat Pro, which is the, you pay for that one, like $100, but you only need one copy in the building, and it probably is in the building someplace. Sometimes that will open things that just the plain Adobe Reader won't correctly open. There's also a site, and what is it called? I think it's Reporters. I don't know. It's actually out. Actually, if you search for Sarah Cohen, Cohen, at Duke University. Sarah is she's actually a former database editor for the Washington Post. She's now a Knight Chair at Duke University, and part of what she has created is a sort of journalism test site where she has a couple of staff, good, smart students who are actually testing stuff exactly like that. And they recently did a comparison of several PDF converters on which ones actually do a decent job. And I can't remember the exact name of the thing. It's something like Reporters Lab or something like that. But if you Google Sarah, you'll track it down if you're any kind of investigative reporter. So consider that a test. Okay, you'll find that. Anything else? Yeah.
When you're involved in, say, data set like the one you've done here, when do you know, you can get lost doing
Sure.
one thing after another, it can turn into just a long fishing expedition.
Right.
When do you know to give up on one project and move on to the next one?
Basically, at the same time, even if you weren't using, it's the same problem in other kinds of investigative work. You can keep going down the rabbit hole, keep searching for additional documents and things like that. At some point, usually it's your editor who starts saying, "Okay, it's time to deliver," and that's when you know it's time to focus on it. To avoid getting really lost in it, and I guess one of the real problems with this kind of thing is making sure you have documented what you are doing with the data. Basically keeping an audit trail of it so that you don't, you create some kind of document, maybe an interesting pivot table, you print it out, you put it in your folder, you're working on a project for 6 months. You don't want to 6 months from now pull out that table that you prepared, not have a clue of where the data came from, how you prepared it, what data you left out, what you put in, the date of it, or anything like that. You need to document all those things. So that's part of it. But the problem of knowing when you shouldn't be investing any more time in the project, I don't know. That's hard to answer. It would be on any individual project. You'd have some sense of it. Typically, I have found that it's easier to know that you have everything you're going to get when you're working with data than when you are working with human sources or document sources or things like that. One of the things that we usually are doing when we're doing this kind of thing is I've done a Freedom of Information request. If I'm working on, I don't know what it is, bad cops in Florida, this project that my son did at the paper he was at. He basically, made a public records request for the entire state database of all the licensed cops in Florida, with all kinds of details about their work history and all that kind of thing. So, when he got that data, which, happened a week later or something like that, he basically had everything he needed for that project. They then spent months, going through the data, finding the anecdotes that they were going to pull out, counting up the bad cops who had been fired from, one police place and wounding up getting rehired at some other place because their license to be a cop wasn't being pulled. Those kinds of things. But the data itself was all in hand, near the beginning of the project. So usually the data isn't the problem. It's the interpretation of it or finding the why of the pattern that you're in there, and that goes back to any other kind of investigative reporting. Yeah.
You mentioned that sometimes you've had data sets which have been too big for Excel. What do you use if that's the case?
Microsoft Access is capable of handling, you know, data sets with millions of records. I personally don't like Access much. I think it barks at the moon. But it's, you know, if it's one of those, if all you have is a hammer, that, you know, then everything looks like a nail, and Access will do those kinds of things. And there are lots of projects that have been successfully done using that. I use a program called SAS, which is expensive, requires you to write programs and so on, and I use it only because I stumbled into it 30 years ago, and it's sort of what I know. So, but I would say most things, particularly of those, you know, too big for Excel, I would do an Access. Often what I do when I actually do use Access is to pull it into, you know, pull that big thing into Access, and then maybe extract out the part that I'm actually really interested in. You know, that's sort of another trick. When you make a public records request of an agency, don't ask for just the data you are interested in, because it actually costs more for them to write a program to, you know, let's say you're looking at, I don't know, robberies in Melbourne. If you go to the cops and say, I want a database of all the robberies that occurred in Melbourne in the last 6 months, they have to write a program that puts everything else away. I would go in and say, I'd like the database of everything reported to you in the last, I don't know, 5 years or whatever you have. You can then, you know, pull it into something like Access, use that to extract out the stuff you're interested in for that story, but then you have all that other stuff that may turn out to be actually better. So, so asking for everything is often cheaper and faster than asking for part of it. And you can use something like Access to pull out the part that actually you're interested in. Other questions, comments, ideas? Yeah.
In terms of breaking down the data further, say you had your crime stats there for all your local government areas.
Yeah.
But if I was just to look at one and say look at addresses of all the robberies,
Yeah.
that kind of thing, how forthcoming are police in providing that kind of detail?
I have no idea here in Australia. I know that they have it because these numbers are not, the numbers you see there are actually a pivot table. Okay, what this is actually they used a computer to take all their individual reports, each one of those individual robberies, and summarize them up and add them up for the year. But what they really have is a database someplace or other where each row is a, let's say, a robbery, and it'll have, you know, the address, it'll have the date, the time, the, you know, was anybody arrested, the officer that investigated it, you know, any other bit of information about it will all be in that database. I absolutely would go and ask for that database. You know, it's much more interesting than this thing. You could always use that database to produce this, but you could answer far more interesting questions with that. Like, you know, what time of day do robberies tend to occur? What parts of town are they more likely to occur than others? Much more interesting database. So I would say absolutely go and ask for it. The worst they can tell you is no. And when they tell you no, you could say, okay, tell me the, you know, the exemption to the public records law, the statutory exemption to the public records law that keeps you from answering my request for this public record. In other words, don't just say, oh well, okay, you're not going to give it to me. You know, make them justify it, and that may make them think about it a bit. And particularly if you can kind of develop a relationship with the people that have this kind of data, they may begin to realize that, you know, you're going to write a story about, you know, the problems they're dealing with, and you may help focus, you know. I mean, it's the kind of thing, if I'm a police chief and the paper is writing story about, you know, our problem with crime, you know, if I'm the police chief, I'm taking that story to the people who do the funding and saying, hey, you know, we need more money. So, you know, that's again the kind of reporting that you already know how to do, develop those sources and get people talking and so on. Anything else?
There's no more questions.
Yep.
I'd just like to thank Steve. I mean, I know as journalists we basically just want the bottom line, you know, give me the story so that I can write it, but frankly it ain't going to happen. We've got to learn to do this ourselves because no one's going to hand us the information.
Well, government will hand you a bottom line, but it'll be the one they want you to see. And that's why I like this, is because we can see whether it matches up.
So if you want to do original reporting, and it strikes me that you can take this as evidence to the local MP and say, well, you know, in this area crime is a lot higher than the average, and I'll say, no, it's not. You've suddenly got some evidence to present, and you've suddenly got a story. So encourage everyone to do it. Steve's been incredibly generous. He could be out looking at penguins and
I'm still going to do
stuff
that,
like
but
he's also very modest because his Hurricane Andrew story has, you know, he won a Pulitzer Prize, or the team that he worked in, including Steve, won a Pulitzer Prize for it. And it doesn't go around
My pleasure.
Inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.